She walked in like she belonged, but no one recognized her, not the ranchers, not the breeders, not even the grizzled old man who ran the auction and had seen just about everything except her. The girl wore dusty jeans and worn-out boots that had seen long mornings and longer nights, and a flannel shirt with sleeves rolled up just high enough to show the edges of an old tattoo. Something simple and quiet like her. Her face was calm, but her eyes were not. They moved like searchlights scanning the rows of dogs, as if one of them held something more than a price tag, more than a pedigree, more than bark and bone. The auction yard buzzed with movement. Trucks backed in with trailers, crates slid open, and handlers shouted over the din. Men in vests leaned on fences pointing and nodding and checking lists, and still she kept walking through it all without a clipboard, without a partner, without a plan that anyone could see. She passed a tall man with a silver belt buckle who looked her up and down like she was lost, and when she didn't flinch he just smirked and turned back to his phone, because people like him didn't think much of quiet women who didn't make a scene or wave money in the air. The dogs were loud, some barking wildly, others pacing back and forth, while a few just sat still and watched her pass, their eyes sharp and quiet like hers. And every so often she stopped in front of a pen, tilted her head, and moved on again. Each pen had a tag with numbers and names and birth dates, but she barely glanced at them. She wasn't looking for a deal or a show dog or anything with papers. She was looking for something older, something that couldn't be written down, something that people forgot about when they started counting things by profit and points. A teenage boy called out a joke from the loading gate, something about her being in the wrong place for cute puppies, and when she didn't laugh or turn, the man next to him elbowed him hard and told him to shut it, because he saw something in the way she moved, something that felt serious, not angry, not proud, just steady, like she was walking a road she already knew. Near the main ring she paused, and for a moment the light hit her face just right, and the auctioneer looked up from his clipboard and frowned, trying to place her. There was something familiar about her, the shape of her jaw, or maybe the way she stood, hands at her sides, shoulders relaxed like she'd been trained to stay still when it mattered most. But before he could ask, she was already past him, heading toward the holding pens behind the barn, the section where the older dogs were kept, the ones harder to sell, the ones nobody came for first. And still no one stopped her, because sometimes a person walks into a place and the place knows better than to get in the way. Rachel had one thing in her jacket pocket, and it wasn't cash, it was a photo, aged and bent from years of being folded and unfolded over and over again, the corners soft like cloth, the colors faded until it looked more like a memory than an image. But it was real, and it was all she had left. The photo showed her father in his uniform, his hand resting on the head of a large German shepherd, both of them standing proud in front of an old cruiser, their shadows stretching long behind them like protectors made of light. And she had looked at that photo every day since the funeral, every day since the folded flag and the final salute. The auction moved on without her, the rhythm of fast talk and louder bids echoing across the yard. People cheered when prices climbed and groaned when they fell, and still she moved through the pens like she wasn't part of the noise, like she was underwater and the world above her didn't matter. She passed sleek dogs with sharp ears and clean coats, past handlers who nudged each other and whispered guesses about who she was and what she was doing here alone, and still she gave them nothing, not even a glance. She stopped in front of a pen marked 23 and leaned in just enough to see the dog sitting at the back, a large shepherd, not young, not old, just solid like a stone, with eyes that didn't blink. The scar over his left eye ran deep and angry, but he didn't growl or bark or even move. He just watched her with the same stillness she carried in her own body, like they were looking at each other across a long forgotten road. She reached into her pocket and took out the photo, held it up against the chain link just for a moment, and her hands didn't shake, but her breath caught hard in her throat. The scar wasn't there in the photo. The dog looked younger, but there was something in the eyes, something sharp and knowing and patient. And Rachel whispered so low no one could hear except maybe the dog. She said, "Jax," and for a second nothing happened, and then his ears twitched and his body shifted forward, slow and careful and deliberate, like he was remembering how to be something he used to be. She didn't call him again, didn't speak another word, just folded the photo back into her pocket and stood still as the auctioneer's voice cracked through the speaker announcing the next round of bids. And it was this dog, the scarred one, the quiet one, the one no one had looked at twice until now. And she turned without a sound and walked back to the ring while handlers opened the gate and led him forward on a thick rope leash. People started to notice her then, not because she made a scene, but because the dog didn't fight or flinch. He just walked beside her like they had arrived together, like this moment had always been waiting. The air smelled of sweat, sawdust, and nervous barking, a thick mix of tension and dirt, and the strange kind of hope that only exists in places where lives are being bought and sold. The pens stretched out in crooked rows, metal gates clanging as handlers moved dogs back and forth, and the ground was marked by tracks and spills, and the occasional boot print pressed too deep to be casual. Rachel stood near the edge of the main ring, her eyes still locked on the shepherd as he was led toward The center, his steps slow, his ears twitching at every sound, but he didn't pull or panic, he just moved forward like he understood something no one else there did. People in the crowd turned to watch, not because they knew who she was, but because the scene felt off-balanced, a little too quiet, like the air had shifted, and no one knew why. The auctioneer looked down at his clipboard and back at the dog and then up at Rachel, who stood with her arms crossed and her mouth tight and her eyes steady, and it wasn't the look of someone making a purchase, it was the look of someone about to take something back, something that had never been for sale in the first place. Bidding started fast. The handlers had cleaned the dog up just enough to hide the age and the scar. His posture was strong, his coat dark and rich, and his eyes clear, and someone in the back shouted out a high number right away, setting the pace. Rachel didn't move, didn't blink, and the bids climbed, quick voices overlapping, and the auctioneer, nodding faster than his hand, could follow the crowd, loving the tension, loving the chase, but she just waited, letting the price rise, letting the bidders battle like it didn't concern her, and only when it started to slow, only when the energy dipped and the auctioneer was about to call, did she raise her hand slowly, deliberately, with a single number that was too high to ignore, and just low enough to mean she knew exactly what she was doing. There was silence. Then a kind of confused pause, as people turned to see who had spoken, and there she stood, the girl no one knew, alone against the dust and the money and the rules of the game. And the auctioneer blinked, checked his notes, looked around the ring, and asked once, twice, 3 times, and then dropped the gavel hard against the stand. Sold, he said, and the word hit the air like thunder. A few people clapped out of habit, but most just stared, and someone near the rail whispered, that girl's never been here before, and someone else answered, maybe not here, but she's been somewhere. And the handler holding the leash looked down at the dog and then at her and shook his head like he didn't quite understand what had just happened. But Rachel didn't say a word, didn't celebrate, didn't even smile. She just turned and walked toward the gate, where the shepherd waited, now calm and still, like a soldier waiting for the next order. She stopped cold in front of pen 23, where the dog had been just minutes ago, the space now empty except for a few strands of fur caught on the metal and the old scent of something that had waited too long. She stood there for a moment, not moving, just staring at the gate like it had one more answer to give her, and when it didn't, she turned slowly and walked to the back of the ring where they were holding him for pickup. The shepherd was sitting near a post, watching everything, but not reacting, his body still, but his eyes never stopped moving. He saw her coming before the handler did, and something in his ears flicked forward, and then his tail gave one single slow wag, not excitement, not recognition, just something that hinted at memory, like a half-lit hallway deep in the mind. And Rachel walked straight to him, without hesitation, without fear, and the handler looked at her and then at the dog and said, I hope you know what you're doing, because this one's got history. And not the good kind. She didn't answer, didn't explain, didn't try to convince him of anything. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small and familiar, a leather collar worn soft with time and engraved with just one word, Jax. She crouched in front of the shepherd and held it out, letting him see it, letting him smell it, and for a second he didn't move, but then his nose dipped and he leaned in and nudged her hand, slow and careful, like he didn't want to break the moment. The handler watched with raised eyebrows and stepped back without a word, because he had seen dogs bite, he had seen dogs run, but he had not seen a scarred animal lower his head that gently, not since he could remember. And Rachel slipped the collar over the dog's neck like it had never left, like it belonged, and the moment it clicked in place, he sat straighter, his ears lifted, and his eyes settled into something focused, something quiet and alive. She stood up and took the leash. Not because she needed to, but because it was still part of the ritual, and walked him out through the side gate, while the next auction dog barked and the crowd's attention shifted away like they always did, forgetting the ones that left the ring. Unless they made noise, unless they caused trouble, and she and the dog did neither. They just walked past the trucks and the trailers and the dust without a sound, like they had done this 100 times before. People stepped aside without knowing why. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, or the way the dog moved beside her, like he was trained, like he had been waiting for orders for years and just now heard his name again for the first time in forever. And someone near the fence muttered, she didn't even bid like she wanted him, she bid like she knew him, and she did. When the handler brought out the lean black shepherd with the scar over his eye, Rachel froze mid-step, like her body had hit something invisible, something cold and final that lived somewhere deep in her chest. She had told herself she might see a dog that looked like him. She had told herself she would be ready, that this was just a coincidence or a last hope, or maybe just her trying to find something to fix. But when she saw him, really saw him, she forgot how to breathe for just a moment. He moved like Jax used to move, smooth and quiet, like a shadow, trying not to be seen, but ready to act if needed. His body still strong, but not stiff, his eyes focused, but tired. And then there was the scar, that ugly old scar that tore across his brow like a warning sign, like a story too painful to tell. And Rachel remembered the call from dispatch, the night everything changed, the night her father didn't come home and Jax disappeared without a trace, not a body, not a collar, not a word. She had Been 16 when they buried the empty casket, had stood next to her uncle in the front row holding her mother's hand and staring at the folded flag, trying not to cry because her dad always said real strength was quiet and sure and steady like. The dog that used to sit beside him on every shift, now that same shape, stood in front of her, not a ghost, not a copy, but something more solid, something real and bruised and waiting, and the auctioneer was calling out numbers again like this was just another dog, like he didn't matter, like no one was looking, but she was, and she knew, and her heart pounded like a drum against her ribs, as the voices climbed over one another, bidding, climbing faster than before. Someone shouted out 800. And someone else answered with 9, and she didn't blink, didn't move, because her brain was too full and her hands were shaking and the world was spinning too fast. And then she remembered the command her father used to say over and over in the backyard during training drills, during long evenings when the sun dipped low and the air smelled like cut grass and calm lives, and she whispered it under her breath, barely loud enough to hear herself. The dog stopped mid-step, ears twitching like someone had called him home, and for a second no one noticed but her, the way his body shifted just slightly, just enough to say I remember, and her breath caught in her throat, and that was all the proof she needed, because there are things you cannot fake, not with eyes, not with silence, and not with scars that healed too slow. So she raised her hand calmly, steadily, with the kind of quiet certainty that made people turn without knowing why, and she named a number that made jaws drop, and the auctioneer stuttered, and before anyone could answer she repeated it louder and clearer, and the gavel dropped with a crack that felt like the closing of a door that had been open too long, and she exhaled. The auctioneer blinked twice, his hand still in the air, his mouth slightly open like he had more words to say, but none that could follow what she just did. The crowd was frozen in a strange silence, not shocked by the number itself, but by the way she had said it, not like it was a gamble or a show of wealth, but like she had already decided it would be his last bid before he even started calling the price again. And the other buyers looked around, confused, some annoyed, some amused, but none moved to counter her. The man in the denim vest who had bid before her turned and spat on the dirt like he had just been cheated, like something valuable had slipped through his fingers, and now he didn't want it anyway, but everyone knew he had been ready to win the dog until she stepped forward with that stillness that made noise, seemed foolish. The gavel dropped hard with a crack that echoed across the auction yard, and the auctioneer cleared his throat, said sold, and stepped back fast, like he wanted nothing more to do with this round. And Rachel did not flinch, did not look proud or relieved or victorious. She just lowered her hand and stood there, still watching the shepherd as he stood on the small platform, head tilted just slightly toward her, like he knew what she had done but was still trying to believe it. A few whispers rippled through the crowd. One woman asked, "Who is she?" Another man shook his head and muttered something about city girls buying trouble, and a third person just stared because they had seen what others had missed, the way the dog reacted when she spoke that word, the way he had paused like someone touched an old scar on his heart, not with pain but with memory. The handler who had been holding the dog walked him over slowly, keeping the leash tight, because this dog had not been easy. This dog had come in quiet but stubborn, had refused food for 2 days, had growled at anyone who got too close, except now he was walking with a strange calm. Not pulling, not resisting, just walking like he was headed somewhere familiar. The handler handed Rachel the leash and raised an eyebrow and said, "You sure about this?" And she nodded once, said nothing, because the dog had already stepped closer, his nose brushing her leg as if checking if she was real, and he sat without being asked, ears high, tail still, and eyes locked on hers. People kept watching, but she didn't notice. She crouched down in front of him and reached for the collar that hung from her belt loop, a collar with the name Jax etched deep into the old leather, and she held it out and said his name again, low and steady, and he did not move, but his eyes closed just for a second, and when they opened again something behind them had shifted, something old and silent and full of weight. She slipped the collar on gently like she was returning something that had never belonged anywhere else, and stood up with the leash loose in her hand as the crowd behind her slowly went back to shouting and bidding and forgetting what they had just seen. But she remembered, and so did he. She walked into the pen slowly, knees bent like she was crossing a sacred line, and the dog watched every step as if he had been waiting for this moment, his eyes locked on hers, steady and calm, and something in them flickered like a memory waking from a long sleep. Rachel crouched low and reached out her hand, trembling slightly but sure, and whispered the command her father had taught her when she was just a kid, the word that meant trust and strength and loyalty, a word they had said over and over on dusty training fields and quiet nights when the world felt heavy and dangerous. Jax's ears flicked forward, his body tense for just a moment and then relaxed completely, and he dropped to the ground in perfect obedience, his tail brushing the dirt softly like he was saying, "Yes, I remember, me too." And Rachel smiled for the first time since she arrived here and placed her hand gently on his head, feeling the rough fur and the warmth underneath the scar that told a story of Pain and survival and fights no one should have to face around them. The noise of the auction seemed miles away, the voices faded and the barking hushed, and all that mattered was the girl and the dog and the invisible thread tying them together. Across years and silence, Rachel spoke again softly, telling him he was safe with her now, and the dog leaned into her hand like a man coming home after a long war, the weight of his past slowly melting away in the warmth of this moment. She stood up slowly and clipped the leash onto the collar, careful not to hurry, because she knew he needed time to trust again, time to believe he belonged somewhere, not in a cage, not in a ring, but with her, where the name Jax was more than just a word. It was a promise, a history, a future. The handler watched from a distance, his arms crossed, but his eyes softer now, like he saw something he hadn't before, like the dog was not just an animal, but a soldier, and the girl not just a buyer, but a savior. And maybe both of them broken, but healing in their own way. Rachel turned and looked out at the crowd, now buzzing with whispers and speculation, but she didn't care what they thought. She only cared about the dog beside her, the dog who had been lost and found, and who now walked with a steady gait like he was finally going home. She whispered once more the command, and Jax responded immediately, tail wagging this time, eyes bright and full of life, ready to follow her into whatever came next. And as they walked away from the auction, behind them the world seemed different, quieter, and somehow more hopeful, like a story that had been waiting to be told had finally found its beginning. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a sudden storm, sweeping over dry ground. Eyes widened, whispers grew louder like waves, crashing against the walls of the auction house. No one expected the quiet girl who walked in alone to take the scarred black German Shepherd with the old leather collar, the one marked with the name Jax, and walk out without a sound, but with everything said in her steady steps and the calm in her eyes. She didn't look back, not once, her gaze fixed forward, steady and sure. Like she carried the weight of years of unanswered questions and long nights spent hoping and waiting, and now finally finding the last piece of a puzzle that had been scattered for too long. The dog walked beside her as if he had been waiting for her to come all along, as if the lost years and the silence between them had been nothing more than a pause in a conversation that was far from over. The handler watched them leave the dusty yard, the raised tail and steady gait, and something like respect flickering in his tired eyes, because he knew this dog was no ordinary animal, and she was no ordinary girl. This was a reunion of souls, scarred but unbroken, two lives tied together by more than blood, more than duty, more than the past outside the gate. Rachel took a deep breath, the sun hitting her face warm and real, and for the first time since the auction she felt the knot inside her chest loosen just a little as Jax nudged her hand and looked up like he was asking what now, and she smiled softly and whispered, now we go home. The road ahead was uncertain, full of memories and healing and hard days and maybe some hope, but she didn't care about the unknown, not anymore, because she had found him again, the dog who had been her father's partner, his shadow, his friend, and now hers too, and that was enough to fill the silence, to light the dark, to carry her forward. As they disappeared into the horizon, the last echoes of the auction faded away, and behind them was left not just a story of loss, but a story of love rediscovered, of promises kept, and of the quiet strength found in the bond between a cop's daughter and a German shepherd named Jax, and in that bond was a future waiting to be written, a future built on trust, loyalty, and the kind of courage that never needed to shout to be heard.